Batman is one of the most complex and iconic figures in the entirety of the comic book landscape, and as a symbol of justice and a beacon of hope to the citizens of Gotham, he operates under a kind of strict moral code that he doesn't kill and he doesn't wield firearms. But despite his best intentions, Batman's impact on Gotham has often been more destructive than constructive, and his methods, while they're rooted in a desire to protect, ultimately contribute to the cycle of violence and chaos that plague the city. And so unlike the previous videos that we've done where we argued that the villains had a point, in this video, we're going to fully embrace our villain era and we're going to talk about how the superheroes are wrong and how Batman actually does more harm than good. So the first story that I want to talk about here is The Dark Knight Returns, written by Frank Miller, because this story presents an older and more cynical Bruce Wayne who returns to his role as Batman after a lengthy hiatus. Now, Gotham at this point has spiraled into a dystopian nightmare overrun by crime and lawlessness, and the story is often viewed as a gritty, realistic portrayal of Batman, but it also highlights the dangers of his obsessive methods, because in this comic, Batman's return galvanizes a new breed of violent vigilantes, and his refusal to back down from his moral code brings about a final confrontation with Superman, who's been ordered by the government to stop him. Now, philosophically, Batman's return in this story can be seen through the lens of Michael Foucault's concept of power and its relation to the individual, because Foucault believed that power is not merely repressive, but productive. It creates subjects, it enforces norms, and it shapes societies. Batman's return to Gotham exemplifies this because his presence does not simply restore order, it also redefines it, creating a new norm of vigilantism and extreme violence. And so instead of being a force for stability, Batman's actions contribute to an escalation of violence because other vigilantes and criminals adopt his methods, leading to further chaos. And so his rigid adherence to his personal code becomes a source of conflict, not just within Gotham, but also the broader societal structures represented by Superman. And we could argue that Batman's power, while intended to be protective, instead generates a new form of resistance and unrest that ultimately destabilizes Gotham even further. But looking to our next story, I want to bring back The Killing Joke, of course, written by Alan Moore. And as we've mentioned in our video about how the Joker was right, it's one of the most chilling and psychologically complex Batman stories, because in The Killing Joke, the Joker attempts to drive Commissioner Gordon insane to prove that one bad day is all it takes to push a person into madness. And the story culminates in a final confrontation between Batman and the Joker, ending ambiguously with the two laughing together after Batman offers to rehabilitate him, and the story suggests one of two possible endings: that Batman and the Joker are two sides of the same coin, locked in an endless cycle of violence that neither of them can escape, or that Batman killed the Joker. But the overall narrative reflects the themes explored by Søren Kierkegaard, particularly his concept of the leap of faith, because Kierkegaard argued that individuals have to confront the absurdity of life and make a leap of faith to embrace ethical living. In The Killing Joke, Batman is continually confronted with the absurdity and meaninglessness of his fight against the Joker. The Joker himself embodies a kind of nihilism, rejecting the idea that life has any inherent meaning or value. Batman's repeated efforts, on the other hand, to bring Joker to justice without resorting to lethal force represent his own leap of faith in his refusal to succumb to the Joker's worldview and his willingness to believe that society can even do anything about the Joker. But his refusal also traps him in an endless cycle of violence, raising the question of whether his ethical stance is truly effective or if it only perpetuates the very chaos he seeks to eliminate. And much like our first point, we could argue here that Batman's inability to break free from this cycle reflects a failure to fully confront the absurdity of the entire situation, which again leaves him in an ethical impasse. But at this point, I want to shift over to what I think is probably the best argument regarding Batman's no-killing rule, which came in the form of the Under the Red Hood story. Because in this storyline, Batman's confronted with the consequences of his no-killing rule from Jason Todd. Because in Death in the Family, Jason Todd was killed by the Joker, only to be resurrected and then assume his identity of the Red Hood. But unlike Batman, Jason adopts a lethal approach to crime fighting, believing that Gotham's criminals should be permanently removed instead of given the chance to strike again. And the story culminates in a dramatic confrontation confrontation between Batman, the Red Hood, and the Joker, where Jason forces Batman to confront the consequences of his moral code. Because the ethical debate of Under the Red Hood can be viewed through the philosophical lens of Reinhold Niebuhr, particularly his concept of Christian realism. Because Reinhold argued that in a world marked by sin and imperfection, sometimes the use of force and even violence is necessary to achieve justice and prevent greater evils. Jason Todd embodies this realistic perspective, challenging Batman's idealism by arguing that the no-kill rule allows the Joker and others like him to continue their reign of terror. And we could go so far as to say that this story shows that Batman's idealism is naive, suggesting that in a world as corrupt as Gotham, absolute adherence to non-lethal methods may ultimately allow evil to flourish. And the moral ambiguity of Batman's stance becomes painfully clear when Jason forces him to choose between killing the Joker or letting him kill again. And in this light, Batman's refusal to kill can be seen as a failure to confront the darker realities of justice in a fallen world and his willingness to allow villains to kill. And so following this, I want to go into a story that we've never covered before, but I feel like we should, although it is a very difficult read. This is Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth, which was written by Grant Morrison. And it takes Batman on a psychological journey through Arkham Asylum, where he confronts not only his most dangerous foes, but also his own fears and mental instability. Because the story presents Batman's rogues gallery as a reflection of his fractured psyche, suggesting that the line between hero and villain is much thinner than Batman would like to admit. Now, the story draws heavily on Carl Jung's concept of the shadow, the unconscious part of our psyche that contains repressed weaknesses, desires, and instincts. And in Jungian psychology, the shadow has to be confronted and integrated for a person to achieve wholeness. As we'd mentioned in previous videos, if you don't learn to make the unconscious conscious, it'll dominate your life and you will call it fate. And throughout this narrative, Batman's encounters with his enemies serve as confrontations with his own shadow, the darker aspects of his personality that he refuses to acknowledge. By locking away these parts of himself in Arkham Asylum, Batman is essentially trying to maintain control over his darker impulses. But the story suggests that his repression only leads to greater instability, both within Batman and within Gotham. And we could argue that Batman's refusal to confront and integrate his shadow, represented by the villains that he faces, leads to a cycle of repression and violence that ultimately does more harm for Gotham than good. And the asylum, both a literal and metaphorical prison, symbolizes the futility of trying to control the darker aspects of ourselves without really understanding them. But the final story that I want to focus on here is Batman's No Man Land, a crossover event that saw Gotham City cut off from the rest of the United States after a massive earthquake left the city in ruins. Now, the government declares Gotham a no man's land, and the city descends into complete chaos when various factions, both criminal and otherwise, all vie for control. And so Batman and the Bat family attempt to maintain order, but the story ultimately reveals the limitations of vigilantism in the face of systemic collapse. But this story can be viewed through the philosophy of Edmund Burke, particularly his reflection on the dangers of evolution and the importance of stable institutions, because Burke argued that society has to be maintained through gradual change and respect for established institutions instead of through radical upheaval. And No Man's Land demonstrates the fragility of Gotham's social order and the inadequacy of Batman's methods in addressing the root causes of the city's problems. And Batman's efforts to restore order through sheer force of will are ultimately insufficient because they fail to address the underlying social and political issues that led to Gotham's collapse after the earthquake in the first place. And so we could argue that Batman's reliance on vigilantism as a form of radical action destabilizes society instead of preserving it. And the story suggests that without the support of stable institutions and the rule of law, even Batman's best efforts are ultimately doomed to failure. And so, wrapping all this back around, Batman's impact on Gotham is basically a study in paradox. While he is driven by a desire to protect and serve justice, his methods often exacerbate the very problems that he seeks to solve. And his refusal to kill, while noble, allows criminals like the Joker to continue their reigns of terror, leading to further violence and suffering. And so I would argue here that Batman's struggle is not just against the criminals who threaten the city of Gotham, but also against the unintended consequences of his own actions. And in the end, Batman's greatest enemy probably isn't even the villains that he fights, but the impact of his own vigilantism on the very city that he tries to protect. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Let me know what you think down in the comments section, and let me know who it is that we should cover next, because I kind of want to go back to doing villains. I love celebrating villains. The #1 most voted response, that's the one that gets chosen for the next video. So thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.